When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
Knowing when someone's done something is one thing, but proving it's completely different. We need that last piece of the jigsaw.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
It might be a fingerprint, footwear mark, cell site analysis that can come up with that golden ticket to put that investigation on a different path.
Using the very latest techniques.
Several months or even years later, evidence can remain and still be recovered.
This is the inside story of how science helped solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
The forensics in this case showed us what did happen. Not what could have happened, what did happen.
You've been in the scene. It's virtually impossible to clean everything up. Something is going to be there. If we're looking in the right place, we'll find it.
Without the unseen heroes painstakingly going through forensic bits, I might not have got justice for my daughter.
This is the story of the expert witness.
If we can get to a crime scene, we can nearly always find something. However hard you try, if we're looking in the right place at the right time, we'll find it.
Royal Gwent Hospital in Newport, the 20th of November, 2006. This CCTV footage shows two men piggybacking a third into the hospital. He was dumped at the resuscitation area and the other two men left without a word. It was clear from his injuries he was the victim of a beating. It was so serious, he died just hours later. Police were left with two mysteries to solve: who he was and who had murdered him. The BBC's Penny Roberts reported on the case.
Police really didn't have anything to go on at that point. They didn't know what his name was. They didn't know what nationality he was. They didn't know who the offenders might be in what was a terrible crime.
In charge of the case was Detective Chief Inspector Justin O'Keefe of Gwent Police. He got his first breakthrough just 10 days into the investigation.
We were lucky in as much as that on the 1st of December 2006, the brother-in-law of the person who'd been deposited there came to the Royal Gwent Hospital looking to identify where he was. And at that point then, he began to fill in the blanks as to who he was, where he'd been, where he was from, etc.
His brother-in-law identified the victim as Vietnamese national Tran Win. He had arrived in the UK just 8 weeks earlier.
He had a wife and two children. His dream was that his son would go to university. He lived in a house in central Vietnam in poverty. There was no gas, there was no electricity, there was no running water. And he scraped together every single penny that he had to be trafficked effectively to the UK, to try and provide a better life for his family.
Arriving illegally in the UK, however, meant that Tran's work prospects were extremely limited.
He couldn't go down to the local job centre and look for work because quite clearly he was in the country illegally. So he was initially taken to the Midlands, where he was befriended by a male called Tu Min Lee, who offered work in an illegal cannabis factory. And that's effectively how he managed to gain work with a view to sending money back to his family in Vietnam.
He'd only been in this country for 2 months, and they put him in a house in Newport, and he became a ghost farmer, and that is a single person cultivating cannabis in a residential house.
DCI O'Keefe began his hunt for Tran's killers by investigating the drug gang that ran the cannabis farm. At that time, it was a criminal world police knew little about.
Bearing in mind they were obviously a close-knit group operating illegally, we didn't have too much intelligence in relation to their enterprise at all.
However, it quickly became clear that Tran Win had become involved in a serious criminal operation.
When Gwent police started investigating the death of Tran, they found 20 cannabis factories operating in innocuous residential streets in Newport. Sometimes the neighbours didn't even know about it.
The landlord of the house where Tran worked was unaware of what was going on at his premises, but he was able to give police details of the men who were paying the rent.
That allowed us then to develop the investigation into who might be involved, the vehicles they've used, telephones they've used, and obviously then where they could have taken Tran Win to receive his beating.
As police pulled together evidence from all these lines of inquiry, a picture began to emerge of the sequence of events which led to Tran's death.
A rival gang broke in, stole £40,000 worth of cannabis plants, but Tran's drugs gang thought he was involved in that robbery, and they wanted revenge.
We know that on the 19th of November, telephone calls were made to the boss man saying that they were going to bring Tran Win to London for questioning. He was taken to an address in Feltham where he was accused of giving the crop to another organised crime group. He was then beaten up. And when I say beaten up, I'm talking about having his head stamped on, having his head kicked, being kicked to the face, abdomen, assaulting him in a fairly savage way.
They wanted his beating to send a very powerful message to anybody else who would even dare to mess with them.
Phone records revealed to detectives that gang members next drove Tran back to Newport, where they realised he was on the verge of dying from his injuries.
So what they determined to do before they fled the area, look, if we take him to the Royal Grand Hospital, dump him at resus, he'll get some medical care and we'll run. Then it became their attempts to try and flee justice and our attempts to try and identify them and capture them.
What the police had was phone records, extensive phone records, that tracked the gang's movements between Newport and London, where he was beaten up, and London and back to Newport. What they didn't have was forensic evidence that put Tran with them.
But Justin and his team didn't give up. They traced and seized the car used by the killers. It belonged to gangmaster Min Lee. Detectives hoped to find traces of Tran's blood or fibres from his clothes that could link Min Lee and other gang members to his murder. So they turned to forensic investigator Martin Jones.
There should be a lot of blood given the severity of the injuries, but it was obvious that this was a very clean vehicle. So this could indicate that it's simply used by somebody who is very fastidious, likes to keep their vehicle clean, or could mean that somebody has made a very good attempt at cleaning up any material that could link to any activity. In this instance, they had made a very good job of cleaning up, and it was very, very difficult for the team to locate any real value to any of the staining that we were finding initially.
It didn't seem like Martin and his team would find the evidence the police needed to link gang members to Tran's murder.
We started to get a little bit despondent because we should be finding a significant amount of blood. We weren't really finding anything. We were attempting to look for fibres. That wasn't particularly successful. We were looking for deposits of cellular material because everything was so clean. Samples weren't producing anything for us.
The breakthrough came when Martin and his team put themselves in the minds of Tran's attackers.
We thought if we were going to transfer this individual in this cab, where would we have put him? If we needed propping up by somebody, we need to stick him in the back seat because somebody can support him. If he's in a partially conscious state or an unconscious state, we'd probably strap him in with the seatbelt. We'd looked at the seatbelt as far as we could tell, and there was no blood there. So we decided, well, let's pull all of the seatbelt out. How far does this go? To be honest, we were quite surprised how far a seatbelt will go. It comes out for a long way. So we methodically worked our way down, and then we get to the end, bang. We had some fluid deposits on there. There was barely any visible material as the fluid itself had soaked into the actual seatbelt. What we really need to make sure that this was blood, and if it was blood, it was trans blood. So this is the test we use, presumptive chemical reagent test. By simply rubbing on a piece of filter paper, applying 2 different chemicals, you should get a quite distinctive colour change from the reaction between the 2 chemicals and the blood itself. This is what happened in the Tran case, and we're looking at each other and thinking, we've got something. At last, I thought I was doing my job wrong. I thought we weren't achieving something, we were missing something. If you don't find blood where you really expect it to be, you almost think you've lost your knack, you've lost your skills. But we got it.
Buoyed by the discovery of blood and now knowing where to look, Martin and the team returned to searching the car.
If we really tracked back where a seatbelt made contact on the underside of the actual seats, we found more blood then. Quite a bit of blood that's soaked into fabrics. This really indicates that somebody has been bleeding in that position quite a bit. So we cut out samples from both the base of the seat and from the seatbelt. These go off to our DNA laboratory, and we found that it was an exact match of the blood from the vehicle to the reference sample of Tran himself. It was really clear from our findings that this person was bleeding heavily within the car. He's not just sat there, he's not been out for a day trip, he's injured, he's bleeding, he's been transferred in this vehicle. That's what we were able to report back to the investigating officers. It was vital in the outcome of the case.
Martin's forensic evidence meant DCI Justin O'Keefe now had everything he needed to take the case against trans killers to court.
We charged 9 persons with offences. The wife of Tu Min Lee was convicted of perverting the course of justice, and 3 of the persons were convicted of manslaughter.
But Tu Min Lee himself, believed to have played a central role in Tran's murder, managed to flee the UK before he could be sentenced.
We were in contact with the Vietnamese authorities, and they wouldn't entertain any form of him returning to the UK to face criminal charges. So it became a really long, bureaucratic and drawn-out process of having to travel to Vietnam to work with the Vietnamese authorities to see how could we bring this person to justice.
DCI O'Keefe never gave up in his pursuit of justice, even when months of bureaucracy turned to years.
It's remarkable that the police pursued him across the globe. They were not going to let this drop. And some 14 years later, this man appeared in court in Vietnam, charged with manslaughter.
In July 2021, he was found guilty and he received a 12-year prison sentence.
It's the first time that someone has been tried in Vietnam for a crime committed on foreign soil. The fact is that the police here were not willing to let this case drop. They wanted justice and they wanted closure.
The successful resolution to a highly complex investigation could not have been reached without the determination and expertise of Martin Jones and his team.
Forensics were crucial in this investigation, quite clearly. It effectively corroborated the stories that we were able to gain from other evidence, but the forensics in this case showed us what did happen. Not what could have happened, what did happen.
The satisfaction in working on jobs like that where it's a struggle. If everything was easy, it would probably be boring. You need to be really determined to locate evidence where it's available. You really want to get to the bottom of things, and what we did in this instance, we were all really pleased. It was a great outcome.
DNA evidence and fibre evidence often complement each other. DNA evidence can tell you who was involved in a crime, whereas fibre evidence can give you the why and the how.
Bristol, 2008, 76-year-old Walter Bolan returned home in his car. Local journalist Ozab Elmi covers the area.
He got out of the car to put the security code in his gate. As he's doing that, a man appears out of nowhere, and he then jumps in the front seat of his car. But Walter wasn't giving up without a fight. And the thief gets out of the vehicle and looks at Walter. He steps back in the car and then decides to run Walter over twice. Walter's screaming in agony, and it's at this point when neighbours hear him and they actually come out to see him.
The attacker fled in Walter's car. It was soon found abandoned nearby, but Walter died at the scene. Walter's friend, Emma Fowler, was appalled by the crime.
People were shocked. Who could do something as horrible as that and as violent as that to someone like Walter? He truly was a gentleman, just a very, very lovely man, and always had the time of day and for people, and always seemed to see the good in people. This person needs to be stopped, because if they can do it to someone like Walter, they can do it to anybody. And that's scary.
Avon and Somerset police launched a murder investigation, and up to 50 officers were involved. Now, they had this crucial piece of evidence, which was the CCTV footage.
The CCTV footage showed a man attacking Walter and running him over, but it was not possible to definitively identify the attacker from the grainy footage. Police suspected it was local car thief, 23-year-old Scott Couch. Police already had Couch's DNA on record. Now, detectives hoped to find a match for Couch's DNA in Walter's stolen car. If they did, it could crack the case. So they turned to forensic biologist Diane Robinson.
We swabbed various surfaces of the vehicle to recover any DNA where a person would have handled those areas in driving the vehicle. And we examined the underside of the vehicle for blood.
Diane quickly encountered a problem.
Walter Bolan kept his vehicle scrupulously clean, and so we were failing to even yield his DNA result from these surfaces, never mind anybody else who had had brief contact with those surfaces.
Diane was determined to find evidence and turned to another potential source.
So we were interested in analysing the fingernails because from the scenario presented, it would appear that although Walter Bolan had very limited contact with the perpetrator in this case, there was a brief interaction where Walter tried to remove the individual from his vehicle. And so therefore he may have some skin cells from that person underneath his fingernails. This result was from the right-hand fingernail clippings of Walter Bolan. And what we see is that there is a contribution of DNA from two individuals. The major components match corresponding components in the reference profile of Walter Bolan. That's not an unexpected finding since the sample was taken from his fingernails. But within the minor portion of DNA, we can see components that match corresponding components in the profile of Scott Couch.
The evidence appeared to confirm that the DNA found under Walter's fingernails did indeed belong to Scott Couch. But there was a problem. A tiny trace of DNA material that could have belonged to someone else.
Whilst these components indicate the possible presence of Scott Couch within this DNA result, there is a component at this location here that I've highlighted that did not match corresponding components in the profile of Scott Couch.
However, the difference was so small, it was almost impossible to be certain the DNA came from two people rather than one.
Therefore, I wanted to apply a slightly different statistical analytical process to demonstrate that, in my opinion, Scott Couch was included as a possible contributor of the minor portion of DNA.
She chose a process rarely used in the UK, for which she needed special permission from the Crown Prosecution Service.
This particular approach, known as random man not excluded, is used elsewhere in Europe. And basically what you're trying to analyse is that if a random person from the population had a DNA profile that was compared to this result, would they also not be excluded as a contributor of DNA to that profile?
In the UK, statisticians favour another method called likelihood ratios, but the random man not excluded approach is useful where the sample is a complex mixture. This method offered a much clearer picture of the statistical likelihood that the DNA from under Walter's fingernails belonged to Scott Couch and no one else.
By applying this alternative statistical evaluation, we significantly increased the strength of the evidence, and now it indicated strong scientific support for the fact that Scott Couch may be included as a contributor to the minor portion of this DNA result.
But while Diane and her team of scientists were convinced, detectives weren't certain a jury would feel the same way.
The investigative team were a little bit nervous about the DNA evidence, with it being a unique approach that hadn't been used in the United Kingdom.
The police needed something else to be able to link the suspect to the victim, which was really frustrating because they were so close, they just needed to go one step further.
Detectives continued their search for evidence and asked whether fibre analysis might offer compelling proof that Scott Couch attacked and killed Walter. They turned to fibre expert Kelly Sheridan.
Because textiles can shed fibres really easily, any textile that you come into contact with or you can find in your home will be transferred to the clothing that you wear. So there was a clear potential for fibres to transfer either between the suspect and the victim, but also between the suspect and the car seat. The first place we start is to examine what we call tapings, where a piece of adhesive tape is applied to a surface in order to collect anything that's sitting on that surface. We can then analyse that under a microscope, and specifically what I'm looking at in terms of fibres is anything that's different or that jumps out, or it may be that I have a specific target fibre in mind, and in that case I will examine that taping systematically in order to see if there are any other fibres on that tape that look the same colour, have the same shape as the target fibre that I'm interested in.
Kelly began by looking at tapings taken from a jumper belonging to Couch.
When we examined the tapings from the suspect's jumper, we found hundreds of bright red-orange acrylic fibres that were really distinctive, that clearly didn't originate from the jumper itself, but came from something that jumper had been in recent contact with.
The orange acrylic fibres were so distinctive, Kelly was confident they would be key to placing Couch in Walter's car.
The next stage then is to look to see if any of those fibres on the seat itself. Within a few minutes of me examining those tapes, I could see that there were some bright red-orange fibres that instinctively I knew matched.
But instinct was not enough. Kelly needed to carry out a comparison between the fibres under a high magnification.
At that stage, we go on to more analytical tests where we analyse the light that is absorbed by this particular dye within the fibres. If these two fibres have been dyed using exactly the same dye, which you would expect if they have come from the same source, then the absorption spectrum of that fibre should be the same. Once we had examined all the tapings and removed all possible fibres that looked similar, we found that there were 5 fibres on the car seat tapings that matched the hundreds that were found on the tapings of the suspect's jumper.
The high concentration of these orange acrylic fibres on Couch's jumper, along with the cleanliness of Walter's car, suggested these fibres had transferred from Couch onto Walter's car seat. Police not only had DNA suggesting Couch had contact with Walter, but now, thanks to Kelly, could scientifically place Couch in the stolen car. They were confident they now had the evidence they needed to secure a conviction. In July 2009, Scott Couch stood trial at Bristol Crown Court. It appeared he had attempted to steal the car to get home after a night at the pub.
Scott Couch was jailed for life. Now, the judge ruled that he must serve at least 16 years in prison.
Doesn't bring Walter back. It doesn't make it better for Walter or his family, but at least he was caught. It just goes to show how science now can have a huge impact on helping the police and the criminal justice system, basically, find people who are responsible for crimes.
I was very pleased that a conviction was achieved, particularly as we had applied a slightly different approach to the DNA analysis and the evaluation of the evidence in that case.
I think in this particular case, the fibre evidence was absolutely crucial. So without that fibre evidence, the conviction may never have happened.